The NHS crisis needs to change. Labour promised us change. However, the change is that things will get worse before they'll get better. And then they're not going to get that much better. Keir Starmer's been talking about NHS reform. It's not a plan yet. Reform isn't a plan. Reform is what we've had before. What Starmer seems to be saying is that we can reform better than the last lot. But as we'll see, the problem is lack of funding, and there will be no NHS recovery without a dramatic increase in funding. But Labour is offering us austerity 2.0. Lord Darzi was asked to conduct an investigation into the problems of the NHS. The investigation is called independent, but Lord Darzi has served as a health minister when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, so I'm not really sure how independent it is. Starmer told us that the NHS needs major surgery, not sticking plasters. He catalogued all of the evidence of the terrible neglect of the NHS during the last 14 years, which of course we all know already. That's the easy bit of the analysis. We all agree that it needs major surgery, not sticking plasters. But after listing all the problems, Starmer then went on to basically offer sticking plasters. The sticking plasters he offered are what he called 3 fundamental reforms. Let's run through them quickly. First, he talked about moving from an analogue to a digital NHS. He specifically referred to the NHS app and using smartphones as health monitors. Yes, these are really good, but they're not the game changers. They're actually the old technology, and they're already increasingly being used. These may play a role, but it's absolutely bizarre that he didn't mention artificial intelligence. Why no mention of AI? This is perhaps the biggest thing that will save the NHS. A recent PwC report says that AI and robotics are no longer science fiction, that they're transforming healthcare. It describes the potential as vast. It says that AI is increasingly quicker, more efficient and lower cost than humans. This sounds like the magic bullet for the NHS. Surely the government knows this. It's baffling why they wouldn't mention it. It offers real hope within the 10-year time frame that Starmer was discussing. The second reform he discussed was shifting care from hospitals to communities. In principle, this is a great idea. This too is already happening. My local chemist offers blood pressure checks and consultations in a private room on a whole list of conditions. And the third reform he mentioned was to move from sickness to prevention. As with the previous 2 reforms, surely no one would disagree that prevention is desirable. All 3 of the reforms sound good, but they're all pretty obvious, and they don't mean much without some real meat on them. We won't get that until spring next year. But I do think that some of the other things he said indicate that there won't be much meat in the specific proposals, that they really are just sticking plasters. So one very clear point is that Labour will not be increasing spending to fix the NHS. No more money without reform, Starmer declared. He talked about productivity having fallen and that this isn't just solved by more money, it's solved by reform, he said. So how do you reform without spending more money? It's not really possible. Or it's not really possible without things that would be a big mistake. Put more pressure on staff to be more efficient, to increase their productivity. Sell off bits of the NHS or outsource more services to get short-term cost savings. It's hard to think of what else reform means in the absence of increased funding. Let's be clear about the real problem, the years of underfunding. There were things in the Darzi report that Starmer didn't reference. For example, the report highlights austerity as one of the major factors driving the dire state of the NHS. He said the 2010s were the most austere decade since the NHS was founded, with spending growing at around 1% in real terms. And he pointed out that the long-term average growth in NH spending has been 3.4% a year. So it's very clear that funding has been grossly insufficient year after year. It's even worse than that because we've actually had a growing population and an ageing population. So the report concludes that spending has effectively been flat. It's absolutely obvious that this is the problem. Darzi also concludes that the NHS has been starved of capital and that the capital budget has repeatedly been used to plug holes in day-to-day spending. Really, really bad accounting practices. He catalogues lots of problems with the capital stock, too long to list here, but it includes the fact that 20% of the primary care estate predates the founding of the NHS in 1948. That's incredible. He also says that people are still being treated in porter cabins and that mental health patients are being kept in vermin-infested Victorian-era cells with 17 men sharing 2 showers. This is just shocking. Starmer identified falling productivity as a problem. The report concludes that crumbling buildings have negatively affected productivity. This can't be repaired by reform. It's certainly true that the problem isn't just solved by more money, and we do need to do a better job of making sure that the money is well spent. But there's no getting away from the fact that a massive investment is required, I would say in buildings, in equipment, and in pay. This is what will improve things like morale and staff retention, and this is what will improve efficiency. Starmer said that working people can't afford to pay more, and therefore ruled out tax increases. It's certainly true that there are many working people on low wages who can't afford to pay more. But many working people earn good money and could perhaps afford to pay a little bit more. And the super wealthy certainly can afford to pay more. Why is Starmer protecting the rich? We need bold initiatives. We need courage. I think the strategy should be to convince people of the case for extra tax. As a country, we can't afford not to pay more for the health service that most people want. We've heard it before about improving efficiency, reforms, increasing productivity. All important, yes, but life and death critical is funding. One other point Starmer made, which I found disappointing. He said that getting people back to health and work would not only reduce the costs on the NHS, it would help drive economic growth and fund public services. This seems similar to the Tory party idea that people getting back into work will reduce the burden on the NHS. What is this saying other than people aren't working because they're signed off sick? This is the same as the Tory policy. Coax the sick back into work. This will allow public services to be funded when the sick start paying tax. This is so sad. The causality is the wrong way round here. We need to increase funding by investing in the NHS. People will then get better, and then they can go back to work and contribute towards economic growth. One major omission from the report, or Starmer's speech, is any mention of outsourcing, of using private companies to provide services rather than the NHS doing it internally. It's difficult to analyse the impact of outsourcing, which is why any independent report should have considered it. But just a quick Google search at least shows that there are questions. The Economics Observatory reviewed the literature and concluded that the evidence from assessments of the quality of outsourced health services very rarely suggests that outsourcing is a good idea. Despite this, they say more and more services are outsourced to the private sector. Another thing I found was an article in The Lancet, which was in the context of nursing home care, but this concluded that neoliberal market values such as competition, consumer choice and the profit motive make poor guiding principles for the care sector. And the BMA, in a recent article on NHS outsourcing, says that outsourcing of NHS contracts threatens the clinical and financial viability and sustainability of the NHS. Look, I'm not presenting any of this as conclusive evidence that outsourcing has harmed the NHS, but it is evidence that the issue is sufficient to raise a question, and it's bizarre that the report didn't consider it. But I think that this shows us how independent the report really is. It must have been the case that the government imposed a kind of pre-existing agenda which was baked into the terms of reference. Whatever you do, don't mention outsourcing. I do think this is a critical point. As we've discovered with the neoliberal disaster of energy privatisation, some industries can't be run on the basis of a profit motive, not least the fact that dividends to shareholders take money out of the system. The NHS should be run as efficiently as possible, but all of the money should stay within the system. The NHS has worked best when it's been run by the state. That is the beauty of it. One final thought, and this is a bit controversial. None of this fanfare has included any consideration of whether we should introduce some kind of charging for using the NHS. The reason for this is that the starting point is always that the NHS should be free at the point of use. However, I think it would be worth at least considering the idea of making an affordable, modest charge when people use the NHS, free to those on low incomes, as is the case with dentistry and prescriptions. I love the NHS being free, but given that we're in a crisis, I think that considering modest charging to help finance the recovery is much better than allowing the privatisation of the NHS through the back door. All in all, this feels like a mess. It feels like hot air. Change, reform, it's not going to cut it. The only solution is to invest in the country by putting a lot more money into the NHS. I hope you found this information useful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.